Okay, so this deep dive. Yeah, this one's going to be a little heavy. You might want to grab a seat for this.
Yeah, definitely not light subject matter this time.
It's disturbing, fascinating. I don't even know. It's a real head scratcher, to say the least.
It's heavy stuff for sure.
So the source material we're looking at here, it's a single video clip, and it's raw footage.
Oh, what?
Think interrogation room. No fancy editing or anything. And it seems to be a confession in what appears to be a domestic violence case. You're right there, hearing the voices, the emotion. It's intense.
Sounds raw.
It is. So the man in the video, they call him Timmy, he admits to killing his partner, says he found her sex chatting with another man, claims he reacted in a fit of rage.
I see. And is that where the no regrets thing comes in?
Yeah, that's the part that really gets me. He keeps saying over and over, I have no regrets, and his demeanor, it's calm, almost detached.
That's chilling,
Yeah.
especially given what he's describing.
It's like he's talking about the weather, not taking a life. It really makes you wonder, like, what's going on in his mind? I mean, is this what they call a crime of passion?
Well, that term gets thrown around a lot.
Ugh.
But legally speaking, it's a specific thing. It means the crime was driven by a sudden, intense emotion, not premeditation.
Okay, so like a heat of the moment kind of thing.
Right. And in some cases, it can actually be a mitigating factor when it comes to sentencing. But it rarely excuses the act itself, you know.
So even if the law says, hey, people can act in the heat of the moment, it doesn't just let them off the hook.
Exactly. You're still held accountable for your actions, regardless of how you felt at the time.
Now, the victim in this case, we only hear about her through Timmy and her sister, who's actually present in the video too.
Oh, wow.
And you can tell she's devastated. Absolutely devastated.
I can only imagine. I mean, hearing her talk about her sister as a daughter, as a sister, as a friend, it's raw grief. It's a powerful reminder that behind every crime like this, there's a real person.
Yeah. With loved ones, a life that was cut tragically short.
And I think it's crucial to remember that. You know, remember the victim as an individual, not just a part of the perpetrator's narrative.
Right, and her sister actually confronts Timmy in the video.
Oh, jeez.
It's an intense moment.
That must have been incredibly difficult.
So Timmy then goes on to describe the murder in detail. He talks about taking a knife and doing what he had to do. The way he uses language is just so, I don't know, casual. It's unsettling.
The language is definitely something to pay attention to in these cases. The way he describes it, so detached, lacking any real emotional vocabulary.
Yeah.
Well, it could point to something deeper going on psychologically. It's possible he's using dissociation or depersonalization to distance himself from what he did.
To protect himself from facing the reality of his actions.
Potentially, yeah. And it's important to note, this case really reflects a much larger issue, which is violence against women. This idea that Timmy had, that his partner's infidelity somehow justified what he did.
It's scary how common that thinking is.
It's incredibly dangerous and flawed. It blames the victim and tries to excuse the perpetrator.
It's a mindset we need to challenge as a society, big time.
Absolutely. And it brings up another point, the role of technology in all of this, especially the way we communicate and form relationships online.
Yeah. Social media, dating apps, all of that.
It's complicated. Technology can open up new ways to connect with people, but it also opens up new avenues for misunderstanding, jealousy, and in extreme cases like this one, violence.
It's almost like the stakes have been raised, right? It's easier to cross boundaries and for emotions to spiral.
Exactly. And it makes you think, how do we even begin to navigate these new complexities in the digital age?
How do we promote healthy communication, respect, boundaries online? That's a tough one.
It's a question we need to be asking ourselves more and more, especially as technology keeps evolving.
So going back to the video for a second, there's a detail about Timmy's arrest that's kind of confusing. He says he turned himself in.
Oh, really?
But then another voice in the video mentions him being caught trying to dispose of evidence.
Huh. So which one was it? Did he actually go to the police or did they catch him?
Exactly. That's what's so strange.
That discrepancy would be a big deal for investigators. I mean, the circumstances of his arrest, the evidence they collected, all of that would be crucial to the case.
So what would happen next in a case like this, legally speaking? I mean, what are the next steps?
Well, after an arrest for something this serious, there's a formal arraignment. That's where Timmy would be officially informed of the charges against him. Then comes the evidence gathering phase. Forensics, witness statements, that confession video, of course, it all gets scrutinized very carefully.
And the confession itself, how does that actually work legally?
A confession can be powerful evidence for sure,
Yeah.
but it's not always a slam dunk.
Meaning?
Well, His lawyers could challenge its admissibility, argue it was coerced or given under duress. They might request psych evaluations to assess his mental state at the time.
Okay, so there's more to it than just, he confessed, case closed.
A lot more. It's a long, complex process, and the outcome depends on a whole bunch of factors.
This is definitely getting more and more complicated. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I think we need to try and understand Timmy himself a little better. Who is he beyond this horrible act?
So we've been talking about the confession, the legal stuff, but what about Timmy himself? Who is this guy? Beyond, this horrible thing he did.
Yeah, you're right. Beyond the legal stuff, there's a human element here, too. What do we know about his background? Anything?
Well, we get a few clues from the video. He's originally from Kia State. It says he's 29 years old, though there's actually some confusion about his exact age. And he mentions working in cryptocurrency.
Wait, confusion about his age? How so?
At different points, he says he's 31, then corrects himself to 30. And someone else in the room mentions him saying he was 32 before. It's a little strange.
Huh, that is odd. Do you think it means anything? Like, is he being intentionally vague, or could it just be, stress, confusion in the moment?
It's tough to say for sure. But it's definitely something to note. As for the cryptocurrency thing, that's interesting too. That world can be pretty intense, high pressure, lots of financial ups and downs.
So are you thinking financial stress could have been a factor in a state of mind, I mean?
It's a possibility, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it excuses his actions at all, but it's worth considering the bigger picture, right? Any stressors in his life. I mean, think about it. If you're already dealing with financial instability, it could definitely add to the emotional pressure, lead to bad decisions.
Yeah, makes sense. We don't want to jump to conclusions, but it's important to look at the whole context, I guess. All the pieces of the puzzle.
Right. And it's important to remember, we can't generalize either.
Mm.
Just because someone works in a certain field doesn't make them more or less likely to be violent. It's about looking at the individual, their specific situation.
Okay, so back to the crime itself. There's this phrase Timmy keeps repeating that really gets to me. He says, life is reciprocal. And he uses it to justify what he did, like his partner's infidelity somehow gave him the right to react violently.
That's disturbing. That whole idea, the way he uses it's a really twisted understanding of reciprocity. He seems to think violence is a way to, balance the scales, as if her actions gave him permission to take her life.
It's like this ownership control thing, right? Where the abuser feels entitled to retaliate, punish their partner for any perceived wrong.
You said it. It completely disregards the victim's agency, their right to make their own choices. It's a dangerous and dehumanizing way of thinking.
It's heartbreaking that we only hear the victim side of the story in bits and pieces through Timmy and her sister. I can't help but wonder, what was her experience in this relationship? What was she going through?
That's the tragedy in so many of these cases. The victim's voice is often silenced, overshadowed by the perpetrator's narrative. We need to remember her as a person and fight for justice on her behalf. She can't be forgotten.
Absolutely, her life matters. So Timmy describes the lead up to the murder in a very matter-of-fact way. Finding his partner, confronting her about the messages, and then in a rage, he takes her life. He even mentions specific details, like using a knife in the bathroom, attacking her while she was lying down.
Those details are disturbing, yeah, but they're also important from an evidence standpoint. They create this picture of the crime scene, the sequence of events. But we have to remember, this is just Timmy's account. His version. It might not be the whole truth. He could be minimizing his intent or trying to spin the story to make himself look better.
So how would investigators make sure his confession is actually accurate?
Well, that's where good detective work comes in. They'd be looking for anything to back up his statements. Physical evidence, witness testimony, any other info they can find. Analyzing the crime scene, talking to potential witnesses, looking for any holes or contradictions in his story.
So even though he confessed, there are still so many questions. What was really going on in their relationship? How did things escalate to this level of violence? What was Timmy thinking in those final moments?
Those are exactly the questions investigators would be trying to figure out. And while we might never know the complete truth, this case can be a starting point to talk about domestic violence, toxic relationships, seeking help when emotions spiral out of control.
It's a reminder that behind closed doors, these terrible things can happen. And sometimes the warning signs are hard to see. Makes it even more important to talk about these issues openly, encourage people to get help if they're experiencing violence or see it happening to someone they know.
You're so right. We need more awareness, better prevention, strong support systems for those experiencing domestic violence. It's not just about reacting after something terrible happens. It's about preventing it in the first place.
So we've covered a lot here. The video, the confession, Timmy's background, the legal side of things. What are your final thoughts on all of this?
It's been a really heavy deep dive, that's for sure. A reminder of the dark side of human nature and the terrible consequences of violence. But it also highlights how important it is to seek justice for victims, understand what leads to these tragedies, and work towards a future where they don't happen anymore. Creating a culture where respect, empathy, and healthy communication are the foundation of all relationships.
Couldn't agree more. It's a lot to take in. But before we wrap up completely, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. That discrepancy about Timmy's arrest. He said he surrendered, but then there was that comment about him trying to get rid of evidence.
Yeah, that was strange. Definitely seemed like something didn't add up.
Well, later in the video, the victim's sister mentions picking Timmy up from the police station, says he admitted to her that he killed her sister and agreed to tell them why.
Oh, right, I forgot about that. That does add another layer to this whole thing.
So if he was already at the station, does that mean he did turn himself in? Or could he have been caught trying to hide evidence and then confessed once they had him?
That's a good question. And to be honest, without more information, it's hard to know for sure. It's possible he did turn himself in, and that comment about the evidence was either made up or maybe just a misunderstanding.
But it's also possible he was caught red-handed and then decided to confess to try and control the narrative. It just shows how even with a confession, things aren't always clear-cut. There can be a lot of ambiguity, a lot of layers to untangle.
Exactly. It reminds us to look at these cases critically, consider all sides, all the possibilities. Sometimes it's not about finding a simple answer, but recognizing that there might not be one.
This deep dive has definitely left me with more questions than answers, but I guess that's how it is with these kinds of cases. They're complicated, disturbing.
I agree. And sometimes the biggest takeaway is realizing how much we don't know. There's always more to learn, more to uncover, and more work to do to prevent these tragedies from happening again.
That's a powerful thought to leave us with. And it leads to another question, really. How do we, as individuals, as a society, move from just reacting to these events to actively preventing them? Something to think about, I guess. It's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? Like, how much can we really know about another person, even someone we're close to?
It really makes you think. We create these stories about people based on, a few interactions. But there's always more to the story, right? Stuff we might never fully understand.
And when something this awful happens, it's natural to want answers, to make sense of it.
Of course. But sometimes there just aren't any easy answers. People are complicated. And even with all the evidence, all the analysis, we might never really know what pushes someone to do something like this.
That's true. But even without all the answers, I still think this deep dive was important. I mean, it brought up some serious issues, especially the impact of domestic violence, how devastating it can be.
Definitely. And it shows us how much work we still have to do. Talking about it, raising awareness, taking action, challenging those ideas in our society that excuse violence against women, creating safe spaces for victims to come forward, get help, holding abusers accountable.
It's a huge problem, not an easy fix.
Exactly. It's about education, prevention, support, justice. It's about creating a culture where violence is never okay, where relationships are built on respect, where everyone has the right to feel safe.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
That's a good question. I think the biggest thing is realizing that these issues, they're closer to home than we think. Domestic violence can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter your income, race, religion. It's a problem we all need to pay attention to and do something about, even starting with a conversation.
You're right. And it's not just about the victims themselves. It's their families, their friends, their whole community. The ripple effects are enormous.
Huge. So if you're listening to this and you know someone who might be going through something like this, reach out. Offer your support. Encourage them to get help. There are resources out there, and no one should have to suffer alone. You could be the one person who makes all the difference.
That's so important.
Yeah.
And I want to say the same thing. If you're in trouble, if you need help, please reach out. You don't have to go through this alone.
Remember, change starts with each of us. By challenging those harmful attitudes, promoting healthy relationships, supporting those affected by violence, we can make the world a safer, more just place for everyone.
This deep dive has been tough, no doubt. But it's been a necessary conversation. It's forced us to look at some hard truths, think about these complicated issues. But at the end of the day, I hope it's left you, our listeners, with a better understanding and a desire to make a difference.